So I would like to welcome you all. I hope you did get the message that today the lecture is going to be in English. Is there anyone who was missing that message? I'm glad. If you have any problems with the English, just let us know. I asked Theodore to speak a little bit slower than he would usually do in Canada, in his home university, but he will try his very best. And he also speaks French and Greek. So if you have questions to him, you can also either speak French or Greek. Okay, this is actually for you the introduction to you of the two courses that you see here. Part of the students in the lecture hall are in an Introductory to Inclusive Education lecture that is taking place in this hall, same time, same place every weekly, and I am the professor in this course. And as I've just learned from my colleague, there's another course in here.
Yeah, those are mine. Ones who have an introduction to subject didactics in economics education. They are found over there, I guess.
And I would guess that the nice picture on the poster has brought some more students here. Actually, when I sent it Theodore the first draft version of the poster, he got back to me and he said, it has such a romantic color. He doesn't like it. And but I think I liked it very much.
You said it looks a little scary.
A little scary. Yes, because if you see it again, you can see he has two little devil horns on his head. The lights behind him look like little devil horns.
Yeah.
Okay, so before I will introduce our main speaker today, Mr. Macha would like to tell you something about the Professional School of Education.
Of course, thank you very much, Kerstin. My role here is the one of a host, co-host, together with Kerstin Merz-Atterlich, since I have the honor to be the elected speaker of the area of action, which is called Heterogeneity and Inclusion in our Professional School of Education here in Stuttgart-Ludwigsburg. And as such, as in my role as a host, it's my privilege to express my gratitude with a little bundle of thank yous that I'm going to give now. The first thanks, of course, goes to our distinguished guest from Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada, Professor Theodore Christou. Please give him a warm welcoming applause for coming all the way here. And of course, for a nice guest, we got a little gift from Ludwigsburg. This is originally from Ludwigsburg. Just a little thing that you can have with your luggage in the flight tomorrow. Thank you very much for being here. Okay, second thank you goes to, of course, Kerstin Merz-Atterlich. Thank you very much for bringing such a renowned scholar to our University of Education here in Ludwigsburg. A third thank you, of course, goes to the Professional School of Education in Stuttgart-Ludwigsburg, in particular to Simone Oechsen, who cannot be here, and Christine Seltzer, who also cannot be here today, unfortunately, who made this event that we're going to participate in today financially and technically possible. Auf Deutsch gesagt, sie haben es bezahlt. A last thank you goes to Julika Thomas and our student co-workers Johanna Pirnbaum and Anna-Maria Birkenberger, who helped us with a lot of hard work in organizing today's event. And a little applause for that also. I furthermore have to make some technical remarks or an announcement. The first one is, we are willing to videotape Professor Christou's speech. If you do not want to be filmed, please contact our student co-workers where to sit best. weil es so wichtig ist, sage ich es nochmal auf Deutsch, damit es wirklich jeder versteht. Die Veranstaltung wird gefilmt. Wenn Sie das also absolut nicht wollen und nicht auf dem Film gesehen werden möchten, dann kontaktieren Sie bitte unsere Hilfskräfte, wo Sie sich am besten hinsetzen können. Vielen Dank. The next announcement is, after Professor Christou's speech, we will have the possibility to ask questions and have a little discussion here in the room. Thank you, Sven Sauter, for helping us with the microphone then. And the last technical remark is, after this little event here, we'll have another event called Meet the Expert, which is in room 1.225, that is in this building, second floor, room 225, where we will provide food and drinks that were also sponsored by the Professional School of Education. Thank you very much. So my doctoral father used to say, people who give long speeches are generally mean. So I better end here and look forward to Professor Christou's wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Yes, now I would like to introduce Theodore Christou to you. And it's a real pleasure that we can welcome him here in Ludwigsburg. It's a challenging part to introduce him to the audience because he has a long biography, and I had to choose a few points to introduce him, and I asked him if I can tell you a little anecdote from his first days in Germany. I think you're the first time in Germany, are you? And he arrived on Tuesday, and he told me yesterday a story, and I asked him if I can share that with you to introduce him. After Theodore Christou has gained his bachelor and master degrees at the university, he has been working for several years as a teacher in elementary schools in Scarborough under the Toronto District School Board. His professional teaching career also included teaching at the junior, intermediate, and senior divisions. This is continuing education. And then he returned to the academy to pursue doctoral studies in history of education. Dr. Christou commenced his academic course on the tenure track in Fredericton at the University of New Brunswick in 2009. In July 2012, his career path led to Kingston, Ontario, and to Queen's University. And we have to apologize that the information on the announcement for the presentation and the workshop today, in this case, has not been correct, because it says it's Queen's University Toronto, but it's Queen's University Kingston in Ontario. He's still there at the Queen's University in Kingston. Dr. Christou's teaching in the Faculty of Education at Queen's extends to several disciplines. In particular, he concentrates in his teaching upon history of education, philosophy of education, social studies, teacher education, and the theory and practice of history. His research is tied together by two questions: what is an education for? And how might we imagine an education individual? These questions are bound by historical as well as contemporary context and complexities. Dr. Christou is also the Associate Dean Graduate of Graduate Studies and Research in his College of Education, and he has published many books, and I just choose two that are related to the two subjects of your presentation today. The first book I would like to mention is titled Progressive Education, and was published in University of Toronto Press in 2012. With this publication, he was winner of the Canadian History of Education Association's Founders Prize for Best Book in History 2012. The second book I would like to mention is related to the presentation today also, is one of his recently publications. Theodore Christou has edited a collection titled The Curriculum History of Canadian Teacher Education, and it was published by Routledge in 2018. If you want to read more of his books or articles, you'll find them on his homepage. Let me also introduce you, Theodore, by a recent and more personal experience that is actually also representing your research areas. Theodore was visiting the Mercedes-Benz Museum yesterday. Besides his nicely pretended but slightly critical comments on the historical facts that have been displayed in the museum about the Second World War, and actually I mention this because we have a lot of international guests coming to Ludwigsburg, and I was visiting with them this museum, and some of them even from Israel. And also the colleagues from Israel were complaining about how the historical facts about the Second World War and the involvement of the company Mercedes-Benz are displayed in this museum. So this was not new to me, but you recognize this as a historian. After he visited the museum, he went to the store, the souvenir store. And he was recognized as a Greek by a service person of the souvenir shop. Asked about his national background and if he is coming from Greece, Theodore answered, "No, I am Canadian." He was born in Canada, but his parents have a migration background from Greece that can be realized by his name, for example. This story has a deep connection to my beliefs about the necessary changes in teacher education under the labels diversity or inclusion in Germany, and their deep connectivity to the policy and governance of educational institutions and diversity issues in education. If we don't change the perspective to our members of the German society with a migration background, we will never be able to fully include them in the case of being a responsible citizen in the present and future and an equal student in our schools. So the goal would be to educate the next generation to proudly say, "I am a German," besides their migration background. So Theodore, I am more than excited to listen to your presentation and give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It was a nice museum. I'm going to put on glasses just so I can see you if you're yawning in the back. For a moment at the beginning, I was thinking I felt uncomfortable being at the front. I'd prefer to be in the back. But as I sit here, I realize that actually you're being elevated. It's from the perspective I have that I'm speaking up to you, and I think that's more appropriate. And it's an honor to be here. I will say some thanks at the end, but thank you for the kind words. I think if people speak long enough about you, you don't recognize yourself anymore. But the summary is that, deep down, all I am is a teacher. I'm a teacher like you will be, and like you are. And somewhere along the line, as being a teacher, I had too many questions that got in the way of me teaching. And most of those questions were very simple ones, like why or how. And so, I haven't been able to visit any German schools. I would like to in the future, but I presume they're fairly similar to Canadian schools, where, at least in the elementary day, you still have subjects being fused into more of an organic whole during the day, unlike the upper secondary and then the gymnasium. But still you have a bell, and then you go to recess, and then a bell, and the kids line up, and then a bell, and you eat, and then a bell, and you come back from eating, and then a bell, and you go to recess, and then a bell, and you go home. And enough bells, I started wondering why we were doing that. And I kept asking people, till they said, Ted, you should go back to school. And hence the story about why I went back to do my doctoral work. I didn't ever anticipate being a research professor, let alone an administrator as a dean. But because when I did my PhD work, it was only to go back to the classroom. In fact, I thought once I had my PhD, I would answer all the questions I had. And then I could go back and I could put my PhD on the wall. And then if anyone bothered me, I would just go, it's okay, I got it. I got it. I studied this. I know it. I have the answers. I found them. Let me be. Except I didn't find any answers. I just found more questions. And so I'm still asking questions. And so I'm not by nature a historian, per se. Or a philosopher, although there is a joke about every second Greek person being either a musician or a philosopher. Or at least pretending to be. But I am thoroughly Canadian. And so as I'm going through the paper, which I'll be doing a fair bit of reading, which is what I have to do here, please ask questions or save them till the end. You also have my email address there, and that's a Twitter handle, which I don't use for political reasons anymore. Now I just tweet Stoic philosophy and aphorisms about how to live your life, which aren't meant for anyone else but only for me as exercises for myself. And so the presentation will have an overview that goes something like this. Past, present, and then a little bit more focus on some of the things you're studying. And I'm trying to use these two headings, the colors blue and orange. I'm trying to match the Queen's PowerPoint slide and be aesthetically pleasing here, because as I walk through Ludwigsburg, I realized two things. Well, there's many things, but two things I'll comment on. One is how fortunate I am to be here. And so I'm very grateful to be a guest, to have the honor of being here to speak in front of you, and to be in this lovely city. But also how much you pay attention to details. And so hopefully I've paid enough attention so that things like the colors match a little bit. But as I walk through the palaces and the gardens, the amount of symmetry, the attention to how one dresses and how one and that's largely a philosophical way of living, and so I give you credit for that. You attend to beautiful things, and we should attend to beauty, and we should attend to wonder, and we should attend to all these things that matter. And I realize I have an accent. Okay. So I'll try to speak slowly, but if you don't understand me, I'll try again. So you'll see, just so you can follow where we are when we go down the well. We're overall headings in blue, and then as I dig down and into the subheadings, I'll dig into orange, or the gold, which would be the Queen's color. So when we're talking about past, I'll use these subheadings, and then we'll come back to the next level up. But again, I just did this as I was sitting in the cafeteria, going over my slides. I realized that I should do a little bit of pedagogy, not just talking, because too much talking is mean, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about history, and so it's important to know that history is not the past. So when we're doing history, we're doing this thing that's a discipline or a subject. The past is everything. Okay? Little activity from someone named Peter Satius. So in your minds, I wasn't thinking about this till now, but let's just take 5 minutes. If you want to write this down, you can, or in your mind, just remember all of the things, or write down all the things that you've done over the last 24 hours. Everything you've done. Everything. Don't be shy. It's just for you. You don't have to tell me. Think of all the things that you've done. Okay, now for anything that you don't have evidence that you did it, like here's my evidence that I bought a train ticket yesterday to go to the museum, a day pass. Anything you don't have evidence that you did it. If you looked on the internet, let's say, you probably, unless you cleared your history, which I won't ask why, you probably have a cookie on your computer. If you purchase something, you may have a receipt. If you wash the dishes, they're clean in the thing. If you made your bed, it's made. Anything you don't have evidence that you did, let go of it. Just think about those things you have evidence for that you've done. Now think about the things you'll have evidence for a week from now. Your bed will be messy again. Your clothes will be back in the thing. The person you talked about something will probably forget because they were thinking about something else. Maybe you filed this somewhere else. Maybe you threw it out because you realized you didn't need it anymore. What's left? Now, a month from now, in December, how many things will you have evidence for of the things you did yesterday over the last 24 hours? A year from now, 10 years from now, 200 years from now, what will be left of your life, of your day? When an alien comes down and looks at your day yesterday and finds that evidence, this receipt, will they be able to tell the richness of your life, of your last 24 hours, of your feelings, your emotions, your thoughts, everything you did, those conversations? Of course not. And so this is what I mean when I say that the past is not history. The past is everything that happened, all that richness, all that messiness, all that emotion, all that drama. I'm just talking about me as a Toronto Maple Leafs hockey fan. Right? All of that is the past. History is only those things we have evidence for. That a historian decides is significant enough to tell as part of a story. So even if there's evidence for it, me when I'm doing my historical work, it may not fit my story that I'm trying to tell. So I may not include it in my story. So when we read histories on anything, we're always getting part of a very small part of, right? I want to just begin by saying, because I'm discussing history, to know that I'm not giving you the history. I'm not giving you the past. When historians do history, there are first order concepts and then there are second order concepts. First order concepts are like, in 1786, this palace was built. I can't remember the dates. For a historian, I'm terrible with dates. First order concepts I fail at. Second order concepts are how we think about the things that are first order concepts. So when we do history or when we teach social studies, when you go to teach, it's important, sure, that the students know something. But it's more important that they know how to think about that something, whatever that something is. You're always thinking about something. So that they're thinking about what is it that makes something significant or not. That you're always basing a story. History is nothing but storytelling with the burden of evidence. Because a history can be false, a story can't be. That there are things, not cause, but more causes and consequences. Let's jump here. That things change and things stay the same. That we always have to look at multiple perspectives. Here you'll get mine. Others will see this history, will choose other evidence, will have other perspectives. All of this plays even into how I was reading the museum yesterday, just so you understand. I was looking at what evidence was presented, how change and significance, right? All these factors, and ultimately this one. This is difficult, but it's the most important reason we do history. It's in order to learn from it. Because if we only learned that in 1776 some building was born or whatever, then who cares? You remember that and then eventually it's gone. If you've thought about it in a way that makes you think about your own engagement with your city, your space, your environment, a museum, a friend, your personal history differently, then it matters more. If it changes the way you think about the news, or the way it changes how you respond to each other right now, then it's changed who you are. You've brought it in here. And the ethical dimensions of history are ultimately the most important ones. Now this is a segue, but I can't not do it because I'm speaking to people who understand education. So this is all to give you caveats for everything I'm going to say next. So let's get into it. Educational policies in the provinces of Canada have emphasized inclusion of students with disabilities for at least 15 years. Right? Longer, but at least 15 years. A 2004 federal report in Canada called Advancing Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities reflected this trend, noting Canadians feel that people with disabilities should have the opportunity to participate in life to their fullest potential. That is part of the Canadian way of doing things. So note this is a federal report, but education, all of education, is regarded by the provinces. So the federal government might issue a statement, but it's down to the provinces. And so here I'll be digging particularly around the province of Ontario, which is where I live. A 2008 report on public perceptions in Ontario that focused on inclusive education for children with developmental disabilities found that more than half of respondents viewed inclusive education in regular schools as the best type of schooling, in spite of concerns that schools lack the necessary resources to support that type of schooling, and concerns that teachers were not fully prepared to teach these students. So that's a 2008 study. By 2014, both early childhood educators and elementary teachers in Ontario reported feeling more confident and more competent to include children with developmental disabilities in their classrooms. In spite of these advances, a report released in March 2018 identified barriers to inclusion that students with developmental disabilities and their parents still face, including attitudinal barriers that limit the academic and social opportunities available. The route to the current system of education for students with special needs has not always been easy or without controversy. And so here I'll review some of the beginnings, the current state of assessing students, and how we go about that when we're in a classroom in Canada. Hence to the slide. So the province of Ontario began to develop a public responsibility for providing children with special needs in the latter years of the 1800s. So in some sense, a long time ago, early 1800s, right? Again, we're talking around the time of these, when people were living in those palaces that I walked by today, right? Around that time. There had been considerable debate on experimentation regarding the education of children with disabilities during the 1800s, especially in Europe. And the discussions paved the way for many of the changes in special education in Upper and Lower Canada. And Canada didn't exist as a country until 1867. But the provinces of Upper and Lower Canada, Upper Canada being Ontario, Lower Canada being Quebec. Lower Canada had been settled by the French and was French-speaking and largely Catholic. Upper Canada was settled by the English and largely people from the UK today, and so had a Protestant element and an English element to it. And so Ronald, sorry, I have to laugh at this line. In 1831, Ronald McDonald, I said I wasn't going to laugh at it. In 1831, Ronald McDonald opened a school for the deaf in Lower Canada. Now, of course, not the clown, right? But it tells you also about Ronald McDonald with a Scottish name, and there is a very strong Scottish contingent to early Canadian settlement. So this venture is largely regarded as Canada's first effort in special education. That was a school for the deaf. In 1841, the division between Upper and Lower Canada was dissolved, and their union started. Although Quebec's education system would remain slightly different because of its French character. A school similar to McDonald's institution opened in Toronto in 1858, named the Upper Canada Institution for the Instruction of the Deaf and the Dumb. So particularly those students who couldn't speak and couldn't hear. The Ontario Institution for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb was founded in 1870 in Belleville, Ontario. That's that building. Which was then renamed the Sir James Whitney School for the Deaf. Sir James Whitney being one of the early premiers of Ontario. And then Brantford schools were open. These schools existed all the way until 1974. So when we're talking about the past, we're not talking about that past anymore. Early examples of these institutions made provisions for students with special needs. The Aurelia Asylum for Idiots, note the language here. We'll talk a little bit about the language. Later named the Hurania Regional Center, was the first institution specifically for people with developmental disabilities. That was established in 1876, the year of Canadian Confederation, or the beginning of Canada. Numerous other institutions for children and adults with developmental disabilities opened and operated over the next 130 years. Many of these had their own schools, so the institutions were residential. Many of them ended up creating schools. And many of them, most of them, at least originally, had training components, because these places were meant to give people training that would help them adjust to life, since the schools would then be inadequate. But again, in terms of the bigger context in the slide I had before, remember that not everyone went to school. It wasn't until 1918 in Canada that everyone had to go to school, must go to school, at least until the age of 14. So we had some people going to schools, and there was already a division of the academic world into some that would be laborers or could never be educated or shouldn't be educated. With those people who then want to go to school, what do we do with the ones who don't fit in with the others? Right? This is part of the discourse. And so the solution then, and I don't mean to judge the past, but we have to learn from it, was that we need special places for them. Right? And hence this idea of isolated schools. By the end of the 1800s, the emphasis in all these institutions began to change, primarily in response to increasing demands for specific skills from industry and from the eugenics movement, which I'll talk about a bit more. An emphasis on vocational training for people with disabilities began to emerge, commensurate with the idea that education and training could equip individuals with skills to become more self-sufficient and to participate fully in an industrial society, as well as in urban settings. Now, there was a pushback around 1918, 1919 in Ontario because the government was formed by a group called the United Farmers of Ontario, which were largely agrarian groups connected to the progressive movement, which elected its first female member of parliament later, Agnes MacPhail in Canada, grew out of rural concerns that to shape the landscape, this is really familiar with you, that the landscape of the country was changing. People were moving out of the farms, people were moving out of the rural spaces and into the cities, because while we didn't have Mercedes, we had General Motors and Ford. And while these are American companies, many of the early factories were established in Ontario along what they call the Golden Horseshoe, around the north of Lake Ontario, from Hamilton over to Oshawa. And so employment and industry was driving people into the cities where the factories were, outside of the rural spaces. And so people started, to, the same way we are today, right, in many ways, looking at the world around them going, it's changing. Look, the people aren't the same who they were here 10 years ago. We have different demands. We have more people in the cities than we had. And other people concerned, well, what happens to the survival of our space if everyone's moving into the cities, if that's what's going on? So whenever we have these moments, this is largely what I've written about in my work on progressive education, whenever we have these moments of social disruption, which are triggered by economic, industrial, and social movements like immigration, we always then go, look, the world has changed, but schools have to change too. And so how we respond to those change is always within our context. There's no general rules, I think, to abstract, but it is, I think, a general rule that schools become under greater scrutiny, and educational reform, in particular the theme of inclusion and exclusion, become primary when we start looking at the people around us in the marketplace. And if they don't have a poster like mine with the face everywhere so they can see them in the grocery store, you say, look at this, my city looks different. What's going on? So the concentration of people in the cities in Ontario started changing. So in 1931, 52% of people lived in the cities. 10 years later, it was closer to 70%. Right? So again, you're starting to see people who are also immigrating. Where are they going to move? Largely to where there's work, largely to those cities, largely where there's industry. And so, again, the drive. Well, how do we change schools? How are schools going to respond to the population needs? This is the idea of continuity and change that was in those big 6 concepts that I talked about before. And so I'm entirely going off script, and Kirsten, you may need to keep me on time. Please help, both of you help me. But there is a paradox emerging, okay? So when we establish institutions like these to educate those people who don't fit into the regular classroom, at least according to our first impressions, we're accommodating their needs. We're saying, let's say initially here, these students who are deaf and dumb, we wouldn't use this term anymore, but let's time travel to 1800. These students who are deaf and dumb are not being served in our classrooms. We need to serve them. Let's create schools for them. At the same time, they're isolated schools. Right? We address their needs, but then we don't do that in the same spaces we do in which they live and work, in which our society's fabric. Hence that federal document that I made, that the Canadian way was very stated as one that fosters inclusion. The one I see here as well. Let's change slides here. Two factors I just want to talk about maybe more quickly so I can catch up a little bit on my time are intelligence testing and eugenics. Now, intelligence testing, I'm sure you've encountered. I'm sure you've heard of the various scores that exist. The thing about intelligence testing when it first hit Canada, largely originated in France and in Europe, and then it was picked up in the US, and when it found its way into the Canadian context, it was very largely understood as this ceiling, a fixed space. Your intelligence is like a box, with volume that won't change. If your intelligence is 50, it's 50 for life. If anything, it's not going to go up. It might go down as you age. Right? It's your intelligence quotient is your box. And so if you have a 50 IQ out of 100, then you are half-witted. So there's terms coming up for each of these. Later on, they became smears. They're insults. To call someone a half-wit would mean to say they have half a brain. Right? So you're starting to see again how the science or the educational institution decides to respond by labeling, because labeling is important because it helps you address the need. But as you address the need, then you start to pull apart. Right? Without that fabric, that language of inclusion, you are in this firm space of the paradox. And so in 1941, there's this comment here that mental deficiency is, quote, essentially incurable through treatment. Right? So it's like an illness. And so, it's an illness that won't get better. It doesn't matter how much education you have. If you have an IQ of whatever, your IQ is going to be whatever forever. So education is not going to do a big difference for those people who aren't educatable. And unremediable through training, except as treatment and training instill habits which superficially or temporarily compensate for the limitations of the person so affected. And so we can give you some habits, we can give you some training that will help you do a job, but your job's definitely not going to be a university professor. It's definitely not going to be this, definitely not going to be that. You can do these things. And with that comes the idea of eugenics. And, you're aware of it, so I won't go on too much, but I'll introduce this person. Her name is Helen Mcmurphy. She was a medical doctor who emerged in Canada as the leading expert on child rearing and social planning. She wrote books, and the federal government issued her a series of pamphlets that were published in blue, and they were common. They were in every house. And they were about dealing with the feeble-minded, was the language used. Right? So feeble-minded people, she believed, should be separated from the population, and she advocated things like farm colonies for them, so they can go and learn to be farmers. They can live away from the population and learn what they're going to be good at. They can't do anything much but farm, so vocational education became an emphasis. Now, is vocational education bad? Of course not. Is there anything wrong with farming? Of course not. Is there a problem with taking children and saying, you will only be a farmer, go live on a farm, because that's where you belong? Next slide. In the 1920s, special education classes could be found across Canada. And these were, again, within schools, but still separating the students. So they weren't about creating institutions, they were about creating what they called auxiliary. And so auxiliary is a term that's maybe familiar to you, but we use it in other contexts. If you've read about the Roman army, you'll know that, say, archers were used as auxiliary troops. They were part of the troop, but they were often to the side and were used when needed. Auxiliary classrooms were like that. They were part of the school system, but they were over here. They were separate entities. So to be a special education teacher, you had to, as these schools are being created, the Department of Education, it wasn't yet a ministry as it is now, the Government of Ontario, would offer 5-week courses in the summer for teachers who were interested. To qualify, you needed to have at least 3 years of teaching experience, and you, of course, had to be interested. And these courses included classroom management, or how to deal with these children who are not like others. Child study, so you learn about the development of the individual. Of course, I'm not presenting you with any evidence, so we can only infer. Intelligence testing, arts and crafts. So it gives you a sense of what mattered at the time, what was thought to be necessary for a teacher. Of course, again, child study, there's nothing in itself wrong with it. To do what we'd call developmentally appropriate practice, we would need to understand child study, that we develop at different stages or through different, that you cater your instruction in a Vygotskian way to the zone of proximal development or to where the student is. That we always teach the student where they are. This is as ancient as humans have ever tried to teach someone how to break a stone open, right? So further impetus for change came in 1922 when the Council for Exceptional Children was founded. And this is largely founded in the US and still exists in both the United States and Canada. But it became a group, a professional organization for teachers, administrators, parents, and advocates for rights of children. And the Ontario unit of the Council for Exceptional Children is still in good operation. Its annual meeting happens in Niagara Falls or in Toronto every year. And it's happening around my birthday this month, in November. My wife, who's a special education teacher, will probably attend. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, increased advocacy for the education of children with developmental disabilities involved parents, educators, and advocacy groups, such as the Canadian Association for the Mentally Retarded. Again, we wouldn't use this language, but now it's called the Canadian Association for Community Living, and other groups. So until 1972, it's important to just pause for a second. Until 1972, there wasn't a Ministry of Education in Ontario, as I noted. There were departments. And so the local school board had to assume a lot of responsibility for education. But in 1972, we had a change in Ontario. We had a government elected that was the same one that Ontario has today, the Progressive Conservative Party. I won't comment on the progressive part of the Progressive Conservative Party today. But the Premier of Education had served as Minister of Education before. So he turned his attention acutely to schools. He created universities. He created faculties of education within universities, such as the one I work in at Queen's. And they commissioned a report called the Living and Learning Document, which advocated things like open schools, integration of curriculum, the final banishment of corporal punishment, smacking children, right, which was still in operation in the late 1960s. And with that came in 1969 this document called the Ontario Education Act, which is pivotal, and that's the first page of it. This legislation was regarded as permissive. In other words, it allowed for school boards to provide education to children, but it didn't mandate it yet. The result was that under Section 34 of the Education Act, some children could still be excluded from school for such things as being deemed unable to profit from instruction. So if you looked at the child and thought, they wouldn't benefit from being here, you didn't need to include them by law. Or for exhibiting behaviors considered to be inappropriate. Again, what that means, you'd have to dig down into the archive to figure that out. Despite the continued practice of education and education of exclusion in the education of students with developmental disabilities, the Ministry of Education was taking steps to make changes, particularly with respect to the inclusion of children with special needs in regular schools. So in 1979, the ministry published a curriculum idea for teachers document, and that document was intended to, quote, assist teachers in developing and implementing programs for pupils in regular classrooms or in specific settings in the primary and junior divisions. This document was followed up in 1981 by a similar document, again, a guide for teachers to help for those students who were included, to help them to include students. I was in elementary school at this time, so maybe in questions you want to ask, but that was like, it was a long time ago. Yes. So here's an important thing about advocacy. And again, since we're doing a little bit of education about history, although progress was being made regarding children in the schools, parents continued to voice their concern about exclusion and to press for a school system that welcomed all children, regardless of their special needs. They argued for a zero reject policy. That's the quote, zero reject, insisting that all students had the right to have equal access to education and equal opportunity for success. The activism of parents and other advocacy groups had a powerful impact on educational policy over the years. And so, let me tell you, as someone who's studied education, the history of education, that the history of education is a testament of change. So for those of you who are looking at the system like I did and wonder why the bell rings and why things are, those are all human-made institutions. And so they can be changed. They weren't by nature decided that they must be such. And that we know that over time things have changed. And when they change because of people like you. They change because of people who stand up and say, this should change. And they unite, and they speak up, and they work through the system, sometimes outside the system, but the change is possible. So you're not entering into a system that you need to be trained for, that you need to be entirely just ready to step into and do exactly like the workings of a Swiss watch. That's not what schools are like. You are an actor and an agent of change. In fact, you're compelled to be an ethical actor of change, to make the world a better place, because there's nothing else worth doing. So the 1970s heralded an era of change in Ontario, and in two provinces, Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. Saskatchewan is a province, if you know Canada at all, it's very flat. You can just see it's all farming. Largely, they do farming of canola, and canola oil is you have canola oil here? If not Chinese, it's typically Canadian. But Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, which is on the east coast of Canada, led the way in passing legislation that mandated education programs and services for students with special needs. There was no possibility of excluding them. That doesn't exactly describe what it should look like, but it did say that you cannot exclude. And in the United States, there was a landmark piece of legislation in 1975 that had a significant impact on Canada as well. It was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. Came to be known by its working title, PL, or Public Law, 94-142. Mandated appropriate education for every student in the United States. The law provided advocates in Canada with the impetus to provide change. Now, in 1977, there was a private member's bill in Parliament that attempted to do the same. It was defeated. But through continuing working, there eventually was an amendment to the Education Act. And that was in 1980, known as Bill 82. So if you're looking at Ontario and you really want to get a sense of a hallmark, that Bill 82 is really one of those pivotal changes to look at. 1980 was called the Education Amendment Act. And so there are 5 main principles of it. I don't think I wrote them down, but they're outlined here. The first is universal access. The right of all exceptional pupils to have access to appropriate educational programs. 2, education at the public expense. that education is provided without additional fees charged either to the pupil or to the family. 3, that there is an appeal process, that the rights of exceptional pupils to have their interests represented, including the rights of parents, to appeal the identification and placement of their children, or to request a review on behalf of their child whenever they wish to. 4, appropriate program, the right of exceptional pupils to a program that includes a plan containing specific objectives and an outline of the services that meet the needs of the exceptional pupil. And 5, ongoing identification and continuous assessment and review. The provision for identification and continuous assessment and evaluation of each pupil's progress, including an annual review of that progress. So we're moving to the present. Eventually we got here. So including children who were labeled at the time as trainably retarded, because, quote, because remember there were others that were untrainable. Including children that were trainably retarded or delayed was a monumental step forward for both parents and advocates who had lobbied long and hard for inclusion of their children in the school system. The admissibility requirements that had existed previously were now removed, and students identified as trainably retarded, or TR, could at least have open access to the programs established for them. The amendments confirmed that TR students had the right to attend TR schools or have classes set up for them when those schools weren't there. They also had the right to instruction in either English or French, one of the 2 official languages in Canada. Further, the costs associated were addressed entirely, and the school board had the option of either setting up schools or of purchasing this service initially. So they were given a 5-year period where if they couldn't find a way to develop these programs, they could hire another school board to implement it for them. I'll just let you read there while I talk. So this is the identification and placement of exceptional pupils. This is policy. There's 2 parts to it. I'll hit the next slide next. So that representative that you see there, that could often be a parent, but wouldn't necessarily have to be. And that there would be the development of a parent guide. Because one of the things that research shows is that particularly when when their own children are being identified, parents don't know how to navigate the system. They have fear, they have worries, they have concerns, and that they need an education also to help them to advocate for their own children. And that education is, it doesn't say this explicitly, but I'd be remiss not to say that education is always, we have to understand, bigger than schools. Right? Schools are one part of education, but not it. Education continues outside it. And this, get into this IPRC process. Since the Education Amendment Act came in 1980, several changes have been made to the original legislation, as noted. The most significant of these occurred in 1998, entitled the Identification and Placement of Exceptional Pupils, Regulation 181, 198, which I've started to show you. So the regulation upheld and updated the legal requirements and the process for identifying a student as exceptional. So Ontario has created this process called the IPRC, or the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, as the last stage. It has the challenges of, as a team, 1, understanding the context, 2, identifying the needs of the student, 3, discussing those needs in the open forum that includes the parents, the student, the stakeholders in the school, a formal assessment, informal supports, and the IPRC process. Sorry, every time I tap this, it rocks. I'm making music. So 3 key elements were implemented. The role of parents was strengthened. The IPRC process was now required. And that following the IPRC was a process that had to be ongoing. The IEP process, so the individual education plan that would be developed for each individual student, is a legal document that must be followed in its entirety by every teacher. And by not just the teacher, but by the whole school team. I'll discuss that in a minute. So a number of new dimensions of the IEP process were introduced, particularly in 2017, more recently, that an IEP, or again an individual education plan, would be prepared for each exceptional student, must take into consideration assessments and recommendations of the IPRC, the team that makes the recommendation, the parents, and the support staff in the school. The intent of the IEP is to ensure that identified students receive effective and appropriate programming, to provide a measure of accountability, and to assist in the ongoing assessment of each student's progress. Every student age 14 and over had to have a transition plan included in their IEP, i.e., when they finish schools, to help them prepare to move on. So a remnant, remember continuity and change was one of those things? Some things stay the same and some things change. Those 6 bubbles that I had. Continuity, we're still interested in vocational, but now it's changed and now it's called the transition plan. It's open-ended. It has to be clear and systematic, but that destination isn't leading to a farm. It can lead to any kind of possibility. It can lead to higher education. School boards are now required to produce a parent-friendly guide, I talked about this in that slide, interpreting the regulation to ensure that parents receive a copy of this guide and that they can be involved in the process at any time. And the IEP must be prepared for students who require accommodations, modifications, or alternative programs, which I will talk to. So in general, very quickly, there's 2 kinds of supports. There is an in-school team and an out-school team. All of these are involved in the process and in the IEP. The in-school team is designed to suit the needs of the student within the classroom, and that includes classroom teachers, the principal or the vice principal, special education teachers, guidance counselors, student success teachers, and other people that are affecting the student while they're in the classroom. The out-of-school resources include professionals such as psychologists, speech therapists, medical personnel, and others who might do assessments or inform the process. Moving on to the 3rd phase. According to ministry guidelines, recommendations for placement include 5 options. There was a previous slide on placement. So the student can go to a regular class where the student is placed for the entire day, and this is always the one that is the default. So and I can get more into this. I'm trying to skip over some of the words, but you can flesh this out more in the questions. So that it's always recommended that the student go into a regular class for the entire day, and that if that is not the placement, that there has to be a justification as to why. But there are other options. So the second is a regular class with a resource assistant. So here, the student is placed in a regular class for most or all of the day and receives specialized instruction individually or in a small group, where the regular classroom has a qualified teacher or assistant there in the classroom to assist them. And it's not uncommon to walk into the school in Ontario or even in New Brunswick, where I lived before, as Kirsten said in my introduction, to see in one classroom of 25 children, 4 or 5 resource teachers to support the teacher in the classroom. That's an ideal situation for the teacher and for the student, of course. But again, remember that the IEP is a legal document, right? And so you can't decide whether or not you're going to follow those, you must. A regular class with withdrawal assistance, which would mean that for less than 50% of the day, the student leaves the classroom, but is still for more than 50% in the classroom. The 4th option is a special education class with partial integration, and this is more and more rare, and then a full-time special education class is the 5th option. And for each of those we can discuss. I've got a table of the kinds of requirements that the teacher, the special education resource teacher or CERT, or the educational assistant, the EA, will have to offer in each of those different placements. But for the sake of time, let's move on. I think I had a slide. That's okay. So inclusion and 2 categories of students with intellectual disabilities exist. But first we should talk about 4 categories. So when a student is identified as exceptional, there are 4 very broad categories they can fit under. They can be considered exceptional behaviorally with regards to their communication, their ability to both speak and communicate, their physical exceptionality, or their intellectual exceptionality. So we've moved beyond IQ, although we still have an element of intelligence or intellectual capability there. Within that intellectual capability, there are these 2 subdivisions. So one is a mild intellectual disability, and the other one is a developmental disability. You can read the definitions there. Now, although these 2 categories of students are intended to help educators to communicate clearly and to provide effective services, they are not without controversy. Hence another paradox, not dissimilar from the other one. When we label the student or give them the label of having a mild intellectual disability, for instance, we're then able to trigger, let's say, the supports in the system that they require. Give them an EA support. Give them support for pulling out of the classroom. Give them modified or accommodated expectations. However, as soon as we label them, we also label them. Right? And so there are such catchy phrases being used as labels are for jars, not for students. Such expressions raise questions about whether using labels and categories to describe exceptional students does more harm than good, and whether this could bias educators against students. Generally speaking, however, labels are rejected by the disability rights movement as stigmatizing, emphasizing deficits, and placing social distance between people, all of which can lead to discrimination, which is defined in Canada as unfair treatment based on a person's identity or characteristics. Stigma and discrimination are widely recognized as an issue affecting the well-being of people, we know this, with intellectual and developmental disabilities in Ontario and, of course, beyond. On the other hand, available literature also suggests that there may be benefits to using descriptors sensitively and discreetly and respectfully to communicate and to inform with the individual and with the parent. There are many individuals who I've met anecdotally who have said, who have owned their, let's call it label, who have said it's because of this that I have these, and so I want to have this kind of discussion with you. Diagnoses can help determine realistic learning expectations. They can guide the development and appropriate teaching and learning materials. They can also help others understand learning styles and behaviors that may seem out of the ordinary. So giving them a label then makes it a legitimate, not just one that says, well, I don't like eating fish. Right? For instance, me who has allergies, I can say, I have an allergy to fish. I don't. I have an allergy to walnuts and sesame. But I'm giving you the example of, once I know I have an allergy and I have a diagnosis, I can then say, not to create a crude analogy here, but once I know, I can then say to, an individual can say, I have this identified concern, and so I need the required accommodation, right, in the school. What should be taught and learned? This is a really key belief, and I'm getting to the end here. A key belief is that, quote, each student is a unique individual who has the potential to learn and develop with the help of a carefully planned and judiciously executed program. Every student, each student is a unique individual who has the potential to learn. Right? You have to just take that as the core of the Ontario system as it is. And so everything that we are now working within is built off of that core premise. That everyone is different, but everyone can learn with the appropriate support. And so the system aligns with that. In planning appropriate programs with this belief in mind, teachers should ensure that activities are socially relevant, age-appropriate, interactive, and functional. So learning objectives for students with developmental disabilities have traditionally included both academic and social skills, but can also include daily function skills, such as toileting and personal hygiene. Social skills are also important for later life, and again, we have still an element of vocational element. What do you do when the school is done? And this becomes an explicit concern. So I just want to emphasize this point. Students with disabilities or any exceptionalities in Ontario are included in a regular classroom setting to the degree that it is feasible to do so. That is the key element. Ontario's equity and inclusive education strategy envisions an inclusive education system where inclusion is defined as a way of thinking and feeling about safety, comfort, and acceptance, and is related to concepts of justice, respect, and caring for the human being. All of these factors are integral to the levels of achievement that we'll talk about reporting slightly in a bit. Inclusivity in education is an approach favored by international human rights principles and is supported by the research. In Toronto, for instance, the latest big study came out in 2013, and it was very definitive that this is the preferred method. However, and I'm happy to share this work with everyone here. However, attitudinal and systemic barriers continue to impact inclusionary practice. So that's both the system, the infrastructure, but also the attitudes of the individuals within it. And that's prompted the creation of an equity and inclusive education strategy. And so some of these barriers, teachers' beliefs, attitudes, the placement and exclusion of students, and dilemmas around the identification process, which I've discussed. How are we doing for time? Should I be wrapping up? We got a little bit more?
You can have like 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'm not too bad at all. So, how do we teach students at different levels? So, there are several effective strategies that I think are probably very common, but these are defined in Ontario as being that the classroom should be integrative, that it should be fun, that the concerns should be about integrating across the entire school day, that they should be functional and environmental, that they should affect both the spaces and context of learning, that they should be developmental, the program should concern where the individual student is, and that they should concern behavioral aspects. So the integrative approach, which was one of these, looks at students in a holistic way and is sensitive to opportunities to teach skills and context through active learning and by providing meaningful learning opportunities. So examples given in the Ministry of Education are school trip to develop communication, social interaction, and decision-making and reading skills. Teachers are encouraged to coordinate these experiences with the school, the home, and the community, so that schools are not operating in some isolation. The instructional strategy currently favored for teaching in classrooms where students are at various levels and interests is called differentiated instruction. Do you have this word, this term? Yeah. So this is commonplace, and it involves accommodations, which are special teaching and assessment strategies. So the accommodation is about the strategy, the support, and the equipment that's given. The expectation itself or objective doesn't change, but the way you teach it must change. That's an accommodation. A modification is an actual change to the learning expectations or the grade level expectations for an individual student. So, and then there are also alternative learning expectations that can help students with particular knowledge or skills that are not represented formally in the Ontario curriculum. And so these might include speech remediation, social skills, orientation or mobility training, personal care programs. And alternative programs can happen both at elementary and secondary schools. Now, one of the things that is always a concern for a teacher is how do you do this on a report card? How do you assess? I came here from Helsinki, where I had the opportunity over a week to visit schools at both the elementary and comprehensive schools and at secondary schools. Fascinating. And I have so much that I'm learning the entire time I'm traveling. But one of the real concerns I could tell from teachers is that assessment piece. We're doing this. I see it's working. I see I'm making a difference. I feel I'm including the students. But then when it comes to reporting it, to giving a grade to it, then I struggle. I'm not an assessment expert, but again, this is mostly descriptive. So obviously reporting can be a challenge for teachers when dealing with students generally, but also with students with developmental disabilities. And particularly when they are included in the classroom with other students who have no modifications or accommodations to their programs. So for these students, evaluation and achievement is based on the modified curriculum expectations when they are there. And they are listed in their IEP. So their IEP, their individual education plan, will list all of the modified expectations, particularly if they change from the grade level, any accommodations, any modifications, and any alternative expectations. And those are the ones that will be put on the report card. So the report card, while it has a staple stock element to it, where everyone has, I'm in grade 5, every one of my students has these expectations, and I enter the grades. In Ontario, you enter letter grades for elementary and numbers for secondary. We can talk about that. But there's an element where you can, as a teacher, click a box. And then it allows you to enter your own expectations, which again, you're not making up. They've been part of the process through the IPRC process, the development of that IEP, and then you grade the students on the basis of those modified expectations. And the report may feature alternative reporting methods, such as photographs, descriptions of activities, anecdotes, and others that specifically illustrate the student's progress towards learning expectations from the IEP. Now, we also have this provincial testing called EQAO, the Education Quality and Accountability Office. I'm being recorded, so I won't say more. Students are, it is a standardized testing in some capacities. It's largely considered criterion reference because the criterion is the curriculum document. I've as a classroom teacher teaching both 3rd and 6th, this happened in grade 3, 6, 9, and 12. Only language and mathematics. I've had to implement it in grade 6 and in grade 3 classrooms when I was a classroom teacher. Let me tell you, it wasn't my greatest week as a teacher. Students with exceptionalities can be excluded if their exceptionalities are listed as part of the exclusion. And again, there is another being recorded, but another game that's sometimes played, if you would like your scores in your school to be high, you might that day have a lot of exceptional students who don't accommodate, who don't fit into the rules. Because these grades, while not intended to be on a system level high stakes, we know when we give grades to people. Sorry, I'm obviously missing a name, and so, but I do want to thank, I'll end and allow time for proper discussion. Just particular to the university and to my hosts, to you for being here, to hopefully following along with my Canadian English. And also to co-authors for parts of this. Where's Robert here? David Gard, who's not here. Along with Kirsten, we're working on a book on Canadian inclusion, looking at it from European perspectives and Canadian perspectives. Because sometimes we never get outside that discursive bubble that we're living in. We talk to each other, but we don't often talk outside of the class. And this work is in process of being published, and my co-authors there, notably the one at the top, is my wife. I'd be in trouble if I didn't acknowledge her first, but I did it last. So, thank you.
Thank you, Theodore. That was a lot of information, I guess. And so, first of all, the question, is there anything you didn't understand or you did not fully understand, so you would need more information to understand it really? So first questions related to understanding what he was presenting. Any questions? Yes?
If I get it correctly, every student...
Haben wir ein Mikrofon?
Yes, so everyone could hear someone?
If I get it correctly, every student has to get a label. Even there was like this demonstration against labeling the students.
No, not everyone gets a label, but so the IPRC process is that process whereby an individual education plan is derived, can be triggered by a number of things. So there are many students who will never have an IEP. But to get an IEP, that can be, again, I'm using the term triggered, maybe not the right word, but like the catalyst for it, let's say, can be a parent. A parent can say, I want my student to be identified. I want my student, my student, I want my child, my son, my daughter, to have the opportunity of having modified and accommodated learning because they're not benefiting from the school system. And so they can be the catalyst of change. It can be the classroom teacher who is seeing that the student is struggling in the classroom, and then will trigger the process. And then at that process, you have all of those stakeholders. You'll have either the principal or the vice principal, you'll have the classroom teacher, you'll have any educational assistants, you'll have the special education. One of the special education teachers will be multiple in the school, and they're called SERT, S-E-R-T, Special Education Resource Teachers. In the day when I was in school, those teachers would take the children out of the classroom for part of the day, and we see that this is still possible, but it doesn't happen very much. And they would be the place where the students would spend the morning. But now the special education teacher doesn't take the children out, they go into the classroom. And they support the student, the EDA, the educational assistant, and the teacher at the various levels that they can. They give them resources, and they might pull aside for a bit. The idea is always to pull that way. And so, no, not everyone will get a label, but there's the possibility of getting labeled because the label then formalizes the process and allows, for lack of a better term, I didn't get to a slide I had on funding. Actually, I cut out the slide on funding. There's funding that gets activated if the student is identified. And so that goes to support the individual at the school level. Does that help? Okay, thank you. No, this is great because they give a lot of information.
More questions? Or even comments? Or yeah.
So when you get the label, I think you talked about like 4 options, and the last option was exclusion. Like, is that right?
Let me go back to the slides. I think that I'm using the term labels. The language would use.
No, but, okay.
Yeah, I like let's call it like being identified.
So
is maybe.
If you're identified, you have these several options.
Yes.
And you said that one of the options was to segregate class.
Yeah. So. Withdrawal assistance, partial integration with indirect support. This is, I can't give you particular instances. It's good that you mentioned it. In my experience as a teacher, I never encountered it. But there are particular programs, for instance, one that comes to mind is called KIP, if I remember correctly. It's a kindergarten intervention program. And so it's not actually meant to be forever. It's meant to be a temporary intervention that happens at the kindergarten age when the student is 4 or 5 years old, and then can make a difference in helping them to make that some largely behavioral on occasion, but not often, leap so that then by grade 1 or grade 2 they can be fully included in the program. So I think that there are particular programs that would probably qualify in those instances, but they're rare, and in those instances often will again be because there's a particular program, but that's why I'm saying these are kind of like decreased possibility in terms of percentage. I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly how often that happens, but like I said, it's hard for me to even think of it. It's just a legal possibility.
And these happen at the school, or are there special schools?
It would happen at the school, mostly. And so English as a second language is another example where it doesn't quite fit as an exceptionality, but is just a parallel where we used to have children who would come to Canada, which was very similar here, from a different country, and then they would be pulled out of the classroom for half of the day. Now they're not actually getting that support, which again comes with good and bad. The fact that they aren't getting pulled out means they're spending most time in the day where they're learning, they're hearing, they're forced to speak the language. The full immersion in the classroom helps them. But they are on occasion in some schools where it's entirely necessary and they're not deriving any for a short period. They might spend half the day with an ESL, English as a second language, or now it's called English language learner teacher. So I don't think these are intended to be full-time options where where golf, those days of the isolated schools don't really exist. And so the programming always exists within the school, but in rare instances there might be a program that's held at one school. So that will be for students who aren't in some way, I don't know why, but again, that's where the context matters. For some reason won't fit in. I don't know what that is. Thanks. I opened myself up to that by giving the legal possibility without knowing how often it actually happens.
It's interesting, Theodore, because he told you about the book project we are working on, Robert, Theodore and I, about inclusion in Canada, and I was just collecting data about Canada to compare it with the European countries. And it's interesting that they don't have the same identifications or classifications that we have in the European Union. For example, if I have the statistical data of children in Germany, I have the identification of a child with a migration background, so it's second or third generation, or a child with a foreigner child, Ausländerkind, as we still use it in the statistical data. So if I go to the data in Canada, it's a second language learner, in English or in French. And I don't find any information in the statistical data of the government that tells me what is their ethnical background, their national background, where do they come from? How long are they staying in Canada already? How long do they live there? The only thing that is necessary for the schools to know is they have to learn their second language, English or French, in the French part of Canada. And that's interesting also with other countries, and you've been to Finland. If you go to the Finnish statistical data, in Germany we would have the data, statistical data on children with disabilities, and we would say as many percentage are deaf, so many percentage have hearing problems, so many percentage have learning disabilities. So we collect the data based on the 9 different classifications of disabilities still in our statistical data. When I go to Finland, I find in the official statistical data of the schools, they have the data of how high is the percentage of being taught in the general classroom. So is that child taught 80% in the general classroom, 60% in the general classroom, or less than 50% in the general classroom? It doesn't tell me anything about a label or an etiquette behind it. This is a big switch, a big change in the systems who are going more towards an inclusive education system, that they think about what is relevant to know for the schools. And it's relevant to know for the schools in Finland if this child has a need of an adaptation of the curriculum. That's necessary to know for the school. But if you don't need to select the children on the school types you are sending them, you don't need the formal labels anymore. You don't need the label learning disability or mental retardation or anything else. In the school, if they're in the school mainly, you need other labels. So they have totally different labels, and makes it very difficult to compare the statistical data between countries. It's very difficult. Especially in Canada, you're using the exceptional children.
Yeah.
This is something totally different from children with special needs that we are using. And in Finland, they're talking about children with special needs, but it's something totally different from children with special needs in Germany. So it's very difficult to compare really the statistical data between countries.
And I haven't spoken at all about one category of exceptional students is gifted students.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly this would apply the same way. We often think of it as disability, but the spectrum of exceptionalities is very broad. Anyone who doesn't fit the regular curriculum with regards to either the content of instruction or the method of instruction, who requires an accommodation or a modification, is then considered exceptional, would go through the IPRC process and have an IEP. Can it be a challenge? Yes, for the teacher and for the students. But the idea is that you should stay, at least in Ontario, with your grade level, and that you should have the supports you need in the classroom to succeed, whatever those are.
What really was interesting to me was that you, as an historian, were talking about the changes in the society, in the economy, and everything, and this is leading into changes in the school system. And I remember the colleague who was here in Ludwigsburg from the US, and she started her presentation with a picture. She had a picture of a surgery room. It's not called surgery room.
Operating room?
Operating room, okay. In a hospital from the 18th century. And she said, would you like to be operated, have your surgery in a room like this? And then she switched and she had a surgery room today with all that different equipment and what we have today. You would probably choose to be in this room. And then she had a classroom picture of a school in Germany from the 18th century and a classroom picture from today. And I recognized, wow, why do changes in the society and in the economy and all these things doesn't lead actually in direct changes in the education system? So what have been the most relevant changes in Canada that have led into changes in the school system? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, this thing called progressive education is the first one. And in fact, I actually think that, I'll respond in the same way you set up the question, that they're largely about how, as human beings, we respond to change in the world. And so there's a historian out of the US who just passed away named Herbert Kleibart, who talked about neophobia and neophilia. And so when we see change coming, some people embrace it and some people fear it. Right? Categories are always, whenever you create binaries, they're wrong. But they just for thinking about it, right? We don't hold this as truth. Just for thinking about it. So let's say we see the cycle of the end of your phone, right? The end of your computer. Okay, there's a new iPhone that will come up, and this will give me the new power to mediate the society and have new dongles that I have to buy new dongles to get it to connect to a projector, and then it'll fly, right? And then I won't need to even look at it. It'll know who I am, right? And then I'll be like, bah, this is really scary, right? Or I'm fine with my iPhone 4. It still works. It's small. I know the battery on it's fine, but this is it for me. I'm very happy. And just a gross oversimplification here, but that when we respond to societal changes, that when we look to schools, we often say, hey, the world is changing, and so schools must keep pace with the societal change. So let's bring in that technology, right? What we call 21st century learning in our context. Let's bring in all of these different things into the school so that schools reflect the society outside the schools, is one response. Another one is, you know what? Schools have gotten us so far. Our tradition has gotten us here. Let's hold firm to it. It's firm ground. It's not going to move. The rest of the world might be shifting, so tradition is going to get us there. That's why we still read Shakespeare. Canadian schools. Right? The kids care about it? Probably not. Right? But we still think that it's something everyone should know. And progressivism is driven by three real concerns with schools. One is that they put curriculum, they put the content of schooling over the individual learner, that they don't attend to the active learning, that they're about passive forms. Sit and learn, write an exam, write the exam, forget everything you've written, then go to your next class, memorize everything, write it out, forget it, and move on to the next one. And that they don't relate to society. And so we go through, you can think of them as cycles, you can think of them like a pendulum, or you can think of it like a river with different currents in it. And sometimes one overtakes the other. And so we go through periods where, and this connects to inclusion, where the key to inclusion, for instance, is technology. And so you can walk into a classroom and there'll be smart boards, and the teacher has a mic so that everyone can hear, and I don't know, all these other things happening. And then when the light bulb goes out on the smart board, it costs the principal $250 because that's how much they cost. So all these things come with costs. There are other teachers who say, no, I still believe in the Montessori method, or in the sand pit, and in the water, and playing with manipulatives, and I'm going to invest in Lego or blocks or something else. So, I mean, I guess this isn't so much a clear response, but I do think that the more schools change, the more they do tend to stay the same in the way that we project all of our anxieties and worries about the future and our solutions about them to the schooling system. And in fact, sometimes the way we use technologies, they're seen as themselves not as a means of education, but as the end of themselves. That now in the school I've got this sophisticated technology, I've solved the problem. But that technology is always ephemeral. It's always going to be, it'll immediately go obsolete the minute you bought it, because technology's already moved on. And I think it's that way with desks. Am I on what I'm saying?
I just need to say that some of the students have to move on, probably. I saw some already.
Where are you going to go? This is where it all happens.
I know where we can go. Actually, we would all fit in one plane. From Stuttgart, direct flight to Toronto. I think it's always a great chance. Take your chance while you're at the university and travel to another country. Have a look into other school systems. It's challenging your own opinions, your own sides, and it's never wrong. Even if you see things you wouldn't like to accept, even if there is a bad difference, anyway, it's always good to see the other things. Thank you very much for giving us a little bit of